This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Society, and in this talk I'd like to provide some advice based on my farm experience for anyone who is thinking about getting started with milk production on a small family farm. Before I get into the talk, I'd like to just explain that I've got quite a bit of experience in milk production. When we first started on our family farm, we started with dairy goats and eventually moved up to dairy cows, and then got to a point where we were running a dairy with a dozen Jersey cows in milk, and we were providing milk to families all throughout the Charlotte area. So from getting started with the very simplest setup to milk a single dairy goat all the way up to running a 12-cow dairy producing dozens and dozens of gallons of milk each day, we learned a lot, both positively and negatively, and I'd like to share some very honest and practical information for anyone who's thinking about getting started in milking. If you think about moving out to the country, or if you're already living in the country and you're thinking about getting into farming, there are a few things that really feel like breakthroughs in terms of self-sufficient living and farm life. One of them I always felt was getting established with your first set of hens and producing your own eggs, which is usually one of the first things that families do when they get started in the country, and that's a big breakthrough for those getting started. Another one is adding pigs to the farm. For some reason, I always felt that pigs made the farm feel like a farm. And adding pigs is another one of these breakthroughs. But the thing I think people look forward to the most is milk production, because milk production changes everything. Not only does it change the family diet and greatly enrich the family diet, but it also affects other animals on the farm. It affects the gardens. It affects just about every aspect of farm life. But it's sort of the crown of farm life. And many try to get into it prematurely. Many oversimplify it and don't respect it as they should. And I'd like to talk about milking practically to try and help families get started with it if they're thinking about it, and understand what the dangers are before they get themselves into trouble. Because, as I said, we learned a lot positively by good experiences, and we learned some things negatively by bad experiences. So let's talk about getting started with milking on a family farm. One of the problems that many people have is they get this sense that their modern career is complicated and technical and difficult, and farm life is something simple because people did it back in the old days. We have this arrogant attitude towards life in past generations, and especially with regard to the life of farming, that assumes that things that farmers did and people did throughout history were easier than the things we do to make a living in the modern world. And I think we have that backwards. I think when we get into farming in a responsible way, we quickly learn that the ancient world was much wiser than we assume that it was. that they worked much harder than we realize they did, and that they really had a mastery of the natural world that we simply don't have. And there are many, many principles of the natural world that modern families are ignorant of, that were known and integrated into family life for families who lived in the past when these things were more common. And there's just a lot that has to be learned. There's a lot that has to be learned. And there's something of a natural order in which these things have to be learned. We've got to consider this order because these things cost money, first of all. We've got to make sure that as we pursue these things, we do so in a financially responsible way. And we can't risk losing thousands and thousands of dollars up front when a better plan could have helped us learn things in a sustainable way and avoid any such losses. So that's the kind of thing I'd like to try and help with as I get into this. And I know when I was getting started, this information just wasn't available. I really had to dig and study and use my professional historical research skills, which I use for my work as a classicist, to get information on farming. And I'm not sure how many people would be able to do the sort of research that I was able to do, and I'd like to save you a lot of time by sharing some important points. First of all, when I talk about these principles of the natural world, if you think about breastfeeding for women, most of our families, and I'm going to assume that I'm talking to Christian families here, because that's usually who seeks this information. But normally families are reproducing, and there's children, and mothers are breastfeeding, and the married couples have to go through this learning process where they learn about pregnancy and how the body develops and how the mother's body changes, and then the child is born, and the mother has to go through breastfeeding, and it's an amazing amount of learning that's necessary. I can remember when my wife was just getting started, and she was talking to people from La Leche League, and she was learning from other experienced women about breastfeeding and scheduling and her diet and all of these different things. And it's quite an art, the work of breastfeeding. We call it breastfeeding because we think of feeding our babies with the mother's milk. But what we often don't realize is most of what we need to learn about managing dairy animals and milking on a farm can be understood by thinking carefully about breastfeeding and the experience of a nursing mother, because many of the principles carry over into the management of dairy animals. And there were many times when we were getting started with dairy animals where I would come into my wife and ask her questions about her own nursing experience, because I needed to figure things out working with the dairy animals. And I found that my wife had already figured these things out in her own experience with nursing, and I simply needed to learn from her about different situations and then think of how that information applies to the dairy goats or the dairy cows that I had to work with on the farm. So the more a woman learns about breastfeeding, about milk production, about managing her own body, about her own nutrition and the effects of her own nutrition on her milk supply, and all of those different sorts of things, problems that can develop in breastfeeding, all of that knowledge can be transferred into the work of dairying on a farm. And so I think that's actually a good way to start and to realize that we're not just sort of jumping into the darkness when we get into milking farm animals and producing milk on the farm, This is something that we already know something about. We just have to use the knowledge that we have to find solutions to the questions that we feel we haven't answered yet. But we do have knowledge of the principles, and the more expert a woman is in managing her milk production and nursing, the more she actually can contribute to the knowledge that's needed on the farm to get started with milking. And the husbands, who we assume are usually doing the physical work of managing the farm, need to realize that they've got an expert in milk production right in their own home, in their wife, a breastfeeding, milk-producing woman. So I always found that very helpful, and the more that a woman learns about breastfeeding and milk production, the more valuable she becomes in thinking through the details and challenges of milking farm animals. Because, like I said, all that knowledge transfers over and gives us a very practical place to start in these things. So when we get into dairying, I think there are a number of considerations, because everyone wants to rush into the purchase of a dairy cow with this fantasy of getting fresh milk. And I want to encourage you to pump the brakes on this eagerness to get into dairying, because dairying is very difficult, especially if you're handling cows. Let's just think of some of the challenges. First of all, you have the cow's diet. While some people like to promote the idea that cows can live on grass and produce milk, it's simply not true. It's true that cows can produce milk that they need to feed their calves by eating grass alone, but we're asking the cows to do much more than merely feed their calves. When we keep a milk cow on a farm, we're asking that cow to produce much more milk than is natural for a cow feeding a calf. And in order to make it possible for a cow to produce that quantity of milk and remain healthy, we've got to supplement the cow's diet and take better care of the cow than the cow would normally have in, let's say, ordinary living conditions for a cow. So we've got to realize that we're asking the cow to do much more than merely feed the cow's calf. Just like if we wanted to collect a woman's breast milk in order to feed other people and not just her own baby, we would be putting a great demand on the mother's body, and we'd have to have a way to accommodate for that increased demand. We'd have to obviously make sure she is set in the ideal conditions of life for milk production and nursing. We'd have to make sure that her diet is sufficient to produce that milk. We'd have to make sure that her health is maintained so she doesn't develop infections and sicknesses caused by the collection of that milk and the effect it has on her body's calcium reserves and fluids and things like that. So there's a lot that has to go into that, and this idea that we can simply let the cows wander in the grass field and collect it, it's just not realistic, because we're asking the cows to produce much more than is natural. We're asking them to produce milk for a family and not just for a calf. So we've got to feed these cows. You'll see books on dairy farming recommend something like 2 acres of pasture for one dairy cow, and that's a good estimate. If you don't have that quantity of quality grass for cows to eat, you're going to have to buy hay, and you can't just get any hay that's available as if you're feeding donkeys. You've got to have quality hay that can be consumed in large quantities by a milk cow without causing any sickness or trouble for the cow, and that's not always very easy. You can't just buy the cheapest fescue grass that's available and think you're going to feed a milk cow with the cheapest grass hay that's available. And you may live in an area where that's the only hay available or some other common variety, and it's simply not sufficient for the needs of a cow. And then you're going to have to supplement that hay with some dairy cattle feed that's high in protein and so on. And the formula for that process gets very complicated and expensive very quickly because these cows need to consume a lot of food to produce a lot of milk. So it can get complicated. And now, before you get into that, I would recommend that you get started with dairy goats. And I know this may sound crazy because most people, when they talk about producing milk, they're thinking about drinking fresh glasses of milk out of the refrigerator, or they're thinking about making ice cream or cheese and things like that. And that's all great, but I really think jumping into cows first is too great of a jump, and it can lead to problems. And I just want you to understand that cows will need to be milked morning and evening every single day. And that may sound pleasant, but every single day means every single day. It means when it's raining outside. It means when it's snowing, when it's windy, when it's freezing cold, when it's hot. Every single day, morning and evening. There can be no vacations. There can be no days off. It's very, very difficult. It requires great stability of life to keep a dairy cow. And if milkings are missed, the cows can develop infections in their udders, just like women develop breast infections if they don't keep milking or keep nursing regularly. The cows will get sick, and you can lose a whole season of milking because of an infection that develops in a cow because it wasn't milked continually. So there's a lot that needs to be prepared for and developed before you can handle the milking of a dairy cow. And I just don't think it's a good idea to get started. If you've never worked with dairy animals before, never handled milk, never milked consistently for an extended period of time, and so on, I don't think it's a good idea to get started with cows, especially because cows are so expensive. They consume so much. There's such a great quantity of milk that can be produced, and so on. I don't think it's wise to get started with milk cows. I think it's wiser to get started with dairy goats for a number of reasons. Number one, relative to the size of their bodies and the amount of food they consume, they produce more milk than cows. And again, that's relatively. They don't produce more milk absolutely than cows do. But relative to the amount of food that they eat and the size of their bodies, what's needed to keep them, and so on, they produce more milk, relatively speaking. They're easy to care for. You can easily handle dairy goats in close quarters. If you want your children involved and you want your children to learn about handling animals and the dairying process, it's much easier to work with dairy goats than with cattle. Another thing to think about is when you have dairy animals, they only produce milk when they're delivering calves. The milk is food for calves, so you've got to keep cows reproducing. So that means either you've got to have a bull that you keep on the farm, or a bull that you have access to when needed to keep your cows pregnant and calving, or you've got to arrange for artificial insemination, or you're not going to produce any milk. So it's not just about getting a dairy cow. You've also got to think about how you're going to keep that cow pregnant every year and producing calves. That's the much more difficult part of dairying than collecting the milk. With dairy goats, it's much easier to keep a male dairy goat, to keep a buck on the farm. Much easier to do that than to try and keep a bull. And artificial insemination may not even be possible for you where you are. So that's another thing to consider. It's just overall easier to get started with dairying if you can work with dairy goats. Now, another benefit is that because you're working with smaller quantities, rather than gallons from a cow, you're working with quarts from a goat. Inside the house, usually the housewife is going to have to learn how to handle the milk that's brought in from the farm, and that takes some time as well. In fact, I would argue that the collection of the milk is the easy part, and the more difficult part is actually what goes on inside the house, handling the milk, storing the milk, cleaning all of the equipment every day, and so on. So it's good for the housewife, and I'm assuming the housewife would be handling the milk inside the house. It's much easier for a wife to learn the process and arrange the kitchen in a way that makes milk handling efficient if she's working with goat milk than with milk coming in from cows. So that's another thing to consider. You're going to have to learn about all the equipment that's needed, the milk pails, the filters, the glass jars that will be needed to store the milk, how to handle the milk after it's collected, cooling the milk, storing the milk, using the milk. The milk has to be processed twice a day, every day. So when milk comes in, the housewife has to have a plan for how that milk is going to be used. She's going to have to learn how to make cheeses and different products to use a large quantity of milk. And just that whole process of milk handling needs to be figured out. The kitchen may need to be reorganized. Different appliances may be necessary. We have a large stainless steel 3-compartment sink in our kitchen that we've used for dairying. So there are many things to consider when you get into dairying, and to learn and get organized and get that whole process figured out, learn how to work with milk, learn how to make different products and so on. I think it's better to get started with goat's milk. Now, you may not get the sweet, creamy drinking milk that you're longing for. You may not make ice cream when you get started, but those are things that are worth waiting for, because this process has to be learned. And again, I just think that there are many reasons why it's better to start with dairy goats than to try to get started with dairy cows. So I would recommend you consider starting with goats. We kept Nubian goats. That's the only kind of dairy goat that I've ever worked with. There are other breeds, but you'd have to get information on those breeds from others. But I have to say, the time that we spent working with the Nubian dairy goats was delightful. I really loved the Nubian dairy goats. Everyone complains about goats because they can be a little annoying, but our time working with Nubian goats, I felt, was always pretty pleasant. And once you get into your routine and the goats get to know you and they get used to the routine, it's actually a pretty nice relationship that develops between a farmer and his dairy goats. So we enjoyed that. They're easy to handle. You don't need a whole lot of equipment. You don't need a whole lot of facilities to work with dairy goats. They're easy to handle and much more affordable to feed than dairy cows. So I'd recommend you consider dairy goats, and for my own experience, I would strongly recommend Nubian dairy goats. So that's that. That's my first recommendation. Beware of the impatience and the desire to leap into dairy cows, because that really comes with a lot of unforeseen challenges that I don't think many people take into consideration when they get into dairy work. So think about that. Now, as far as getting started in the actual milking, what will you need? Well, it depends on whether you're starting with goats or cows. And I'm not saying you can't start with cows. I'm just saying you've got to realize that it's more challenging than getting started with goats. And you've got to make more preparation. You've got to be patient and make sure you get everything in place first before you purchase a cow or try to get started in milking. You've got to make sure you've got pasture that's quality pasture. You've got to make sure you've got good fencing. You've got to make sure that you've got a barn where cows can be kept out of the weather, and where they can calve, and where they can be allowed to get started when the calf is born, caring for and nursing the calf, and so on. So you've got to have the facilities for this kind of a thing. And it's much easier, like I said, to get started with goats. So what we did was we built, it might sound large, but we built a 30-foot by 30-foot barn for the sake of our planned dairy work. We built it ourselves. The whole thing probably cost us about $5,000, and it's really quite a simple building. Now, if you want ideas for how to build dairying barns or sheds or anything like that, there's a source for information that I'd like to share with you. Back in the early 1900s, when farming was very common throughout America and the American economy depended on the success of American family farms, the U.S. Department of Agriculture used to publish little pamphlets called farmer bulletins. And these farmer bulletins were published for farm families to give them practical instructions for all kinds of farm activities, everything from building gardens to milking cows to processing milk to storing crops, every possible topic in farming that you can think of. There were farmer bulletins written by state cooperative extension agents and all published by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for the use of farm families. So I would always recommend those old farmer bulletins as a great source of information, because they were published at a time when farming was very simple. We're talking early days of electricity, when farmers were still working with horses and mules and just getting started with tractors, and the advice that was given by the Department of Agriculture was very practical and sustainable. It wasn't the modern crazy stuff you'll get from a tractor supply company video or some YouTube channel giving you advice on how to do things in unsustainable and expensive ways. It was very practical and simple, and they were intended for families living in rural areas where supplies were limited, and the families had to learn how to do things well with what was available. So those farmer bulletins are really invaluable. You can find them online by going to archive.org, and searching for farmer bulletin. Sometimes you can find them just by searching for a topic like how to grow vegetables USDA or farmer bulletin. So if you're clever with the search terms, you can find things. But if you just like to take a look and start getting familiar with what's available, I would just go to archive.org and search for USDA farmer bulletin and see what comes up. And you'll see the sort of stuff that's available. If there's something specific you're looking for, if you let me know, I'll help you find it. But you can get started, because most of those old farmer bulletins are available freely on archive.org, and they're really invaluable when you're getting started. You can get building plans, for example, for barns, for milk sheds, for hog houses, for chicken coops, for feed troughs, fencing instructions for how to build farm fences, on and on. Just about anything that you can ever need on a farm, you can find farmer bulletins that give instructions for how to do it in a sustainable way. And that that age, like I said, of the farmer bulletins, I think it was sort of the golden age of American family farms, and I think you'll enjoy those bulletins. So check those out as a source for instructions on these things. But you'll need some kind of a facility where you can keep a cow. At the very least, you're going to need a milking stall where you can milk the cow regularly, and a calving stall where when the cow is ready to deliver the calf, you can begin to keep the cow in the stall in preparation for delivery of the calf. And then when the calf is first born, you can make sure that the calf is kept with the mother and begins nursing and can be kept under supervision. And shortly after the calf is born, you're going to start milking the cow, and you're going to have to coordinate that milking with the calf feeding, whether you collect all of the milk yourself and bottle feed the calf, or whether you leave the calf with the cow to nurse on its own. Those are decisions that have to be made, and we can talk about those things in other discussions, or if you have questions, you can just ask, and I'll help you to understand how that process works. But you've got to have at least a place to handle the milking of the cow, and a place for the cow to be kept indoors in a comfortable spot when it's time to calve. So that's really the bare minimum. If you don't have a facility like that set up, and I'm not talking anything fancy, this can be very simple, but you've got to have a place where the cow can be kept at calving time and where the cow can be milked and fed while it's being milked, where its head can be locked into a head stanchion, and it can be kept from moving around. You can get down next to it on a stool and collect the milk while it eats its grain, or whatever you have prepared for it to eat. You've got to have a milking stall set up and a calving stall. I would say 10 foot by 10 foot, where the cow can be kept when it's time to calve. So that would be a bare minimum. And like I said, we built a 30 by 30 barn, which had, if you think about the dimensions, had 9 10 by 10 square areas in the barn, and we kept 2 of them as calving stalls and turned one of them into a milking stall, and used the other areas for space to move the animals around, and one of the 10 by 10 squares was used for storage of all the supplies and feed and things like that. So we built that quite early on, and like I said, it cost maybe $5,000 for the supplies, and I'd be happy to share details about the barn that we built, because I don't know that you can get much simpler, but it does take some construction ability, but that's a separate issue. You don't need anything close to what we built at the time. You need a milking stall and a calving stall, enclosed, kept out of the elements, where you can conveniently handle these tasks when milking time comes. Now, that all applies to a cow. With a goat, it's much simpler, because for a goat, obviously a stall needed for a goat who's about to calve can be the same size or smaller, but for milking, you don't need a whole stall to milk a goat. You simply need what's called a milking stand, where it's sort of a bench that the goat can hop up onto. Its head goes through a head stanchion with a feed box in front of it, and the goat simply hops up onto the stand and eats with its head secured while you collect the milk. Very easy to build and work with, and like I said, you can find farmer bulletins that show construction plans for a goat milking stand. Very simple, much simpler than what would need to be prepared for a dairy cow. So as far as facilities and equipment, it just starts with a calving stall and a place to milk where you can secure the animal's head and conveniently collect the milk from the animal and then transport it into the house for processing and storage or use. Now, as far as feed goes, the most complicated challenge of dairying, as I mentioned before, is feeding, because you're asking the animal to produce an unnatural quantity of milk, and you're really going to have to learn how to manage the animal's diet for that milk production. Now, my recommendation, and folks might not like this, but my recommendation, if you have a feed supply shop near you and they sell dairy feed, I would recommend you use the dairy feed, because you're going to learn very quickly that you can't mess around with the feed of a dairy animal. If you get the feed wrong, the animals will get sick or will dry up, and that's it, you're done. So I wouldn't mess around with dairy feed. If I have a dairying animal, I'm going to the local feed shop and just buying dairy feed. So that's my recommendation. You're going to need pasture. You're going to need hay for when pasture is not available. And you're going to need a quality dairy feed that's got high levels of protein, and usually it's supplemented with some vitamins and things like that, just to help keep the animal healthy and strong. Because remember, we're asking the milking animal to give us an unnatural quantity of milk, and we've got to replace the loss of those fluids and nutrients with the food that we provide. And I wouldn't recommend trying to figure out that diet on your own. I would just buy a proven dairy feed from a feed shop. So that's my recommendation. And if you think about the cost of the feed versus the value of the milk collected, it's a good use of money to purchase the dairy feed. You're not going to provide anything that can compare for the same price. So that's my recommendation with regard to feeding. As I said before, one of the biggest challenges with milking is keeping the animals pregnant. Because if there are no calves or no kids, there's no milk. That's one of the challenges. With goats, like I said, you can keep a dairy buck. You've got to keep it far away from the dairy goats, because the bucks urinate on themselves as part of their natural odor. That's how they mark themselves in their territory. It's just how they are, and they smell very strongly. And so you're going to have to keep the buck at a distance from the does outside of breeding season, which is not too difficult, but still requires some preparation. And the alternative to that, if you've got cows, is to keep a bull, which is a potentially dangerous situation, especially if you have the most highly desired milk cows are the Jersey cows, and Jersey bulls can be some of the nastiest and most dangerous bulls that there are. So keeping a bull on the farm requires some extra care, and like I said, there are instructions for how to build a bull pen from the U.S. Department of Agriculture in those old farmers' bulletins. But I definitely recommend getting started with dairy goats, especially when it comes to the challenge of keeping your dairy animals pregnant and reproducing regularly on their normal reproduction schedules throughout the year. And keeping a bull is a real challenge, and artificial insemination when you've got only one or two or a few cows is just not feasible. So that's a challenge, and getting started with goats makes that much easier. So we've talked about facilities, we've talked about feed, we've talked about managing reproduction. These are some of the challenges that you're going to face. Let's talk a little bit about the actual handling of the milk. So let's assume that you've figured out how to manage the animals, how to get them pregnant and reproducing. You've even figured out how to collect the milk from the animals. So now you've got these pails of milk or quart jars of milk that you're bringing into the house. What are you going to do with them? Well, you're going to have to filter the milk when it comes in, and there are special dairy filters that you're going to need to purchase. but you're going to need to filter the milk because in the process of collecting the milk becomes dirty. And I don't mean that in any gross way. It's just little things like dust particles, maybe a piece of hair from the goat's milk bag when she's being milked, or the cow's udders. There's just a little bit of debris that sometimes gets into the milk, and you need to get that filtered out as quickly as possible. So the first step is to bring the milk into the house and pour it through milk filters and then collect the filtered milk. Once the milk is filtered, it's got to be cooled as quickly as possible, and there are a couple of ways to do this. One way, as I mentioned before, we have a 3-compartment stainless sink that we use in the kitchen for dairying, and we would fill one of the compartments of the sink with cold water and dump a couple trays of ice cubes into that. We would then put the milk into quart jars or half-gallon mason jars, and we would, as soon as we got the milk filtered and into the mason jars, we would then immerse them in that ice bath for a little bit, and then move them from that ice bath once they cool down, either into the refrigerator or even into a freezer, to continue to bring that temperature down, and then finally into a refrigerator. So the filtering and bottling process is going to need to be organized in the kitchen. Again, not a problem, especially if you're working with goats, because the quantity of the milk is much more easily handled. But with cows, you get into several gallons every milking, and it provides some challenges until that system is organized and worked out and kept regular. As far as storing the milk, as I mentioned, you can get quart-size glass mason jars. You can also get half-gallon glass mason jars. We used both. We used half-gallon jars for cows, and we used quart jars for goats. The mason jars normally come with 2-piece metal lids, which you're probably familiar with. You know, there's a ring, and then there's sort of the actual lid that goes over the mouth of the jar. Those metal lids don't work too well with dairying because they've got to be washed and used daily, and they rust. So those metal lids are not going to work very well for you. You'll learn that the Ball company that makes the mason jars, they make plastic lids. They make white plastic lids, and you'll need to buy those white plastic lids to replace the metal mason jar lids when you're working with milk. And you can find them easily online at a place like Amazon, or a Walmart sometimes has canning supplies in stock, and you can find mason jars and those plastic lids. Sometimes hardware stores carry them, so you'll need to figure out where you can find a supply of those things. But like I said, if you're working with goats, you'll need quart jars, and if you're working with cows, you'll need half-gallon mason jars. So that's how the milk is handled, and the goal is to get the milk filtered and cooled as quickly as possible after milking. That's the challenge. The milk can't sit around. It can't wait. You've got to get that milk into the house, filtered and cooled as quickly as possible, or all sorts of bad things start to happen. Then you're going to have to clean all that equipment twice a day, and this is why I say it gets challenging until you establish the routine and get yourself all set up so this routine can be managed efficiently and comfortably. But you're going to have to clean all these jars and clean these filters and clean these lids and so on. So there's a lot of time needed for cleaning when you're dairying. You're going to have to spend a lot of time cleaning, and you need to make sure you budget that time just for cleaning milk pails, cleaning utensils, cleaning mason jars, cleaning lids, and so on. Make sure you arrange time for all of that cleaning that's necessary. Now, one of the big issues that'll come up in these discussions has to do with pasteurization. And on the farm, if you're using the milk on a daily basis, there's no need for pasteurization because the milk is being consumed daily on the farm. Now, when you start talking about storing milk or in the case where you might be delivering milk from the farm to others and it may be stored in a refrigerator for a few days, now all of a sudden the question of pasteurization becomes more important because the whole idea of pasteurization is to try and kill the bacteria that causes the milk to spoil. Trying to kill that bacteria to allow the milk to last longer in storage. Again, on the farm, where the milk can be consumed same day, and there's new milk constantly coming into the house, so you would never consume old milk on a farm. When you start sharing that milk with others, all of a sudden you've got to concern yourself with storage. So pasteurization is not necessary for your own family use. You can drink raw milk without any trouble, but you've got to consume it as shortly after it's produced as possible. Think, naturally, the calf receives the milk directly from the udder. There's no storage time at all. So storing milk is unnatural. And we've got to respect that fact and realize you really can't store milk. It's meant to be consumed immediately. That's why I said at the beginning of this talk, when dairy animals are brought to the farm, it affects the whole farm because there's going to be many times where you can't consume the milk that's coming in. But that milk can be used to feed other animals. It can be used to feed chickens, to feed hens, to help with egg production. It can be used to feed pigs, and so on. So waste milk becomes a very valuable feed product for other animals on the farm. So it's not wasted. It's simply used in different ways. You'll have to learn about clabbered milk for chickens because for hens, clabbered milk is one of the best foods you can give them for egg production. So you can radically improve egg production by using wasted milk. And if you've got waste milk or even whey, if you're making cheese, all of that leftover byproduct can be fed to the pigs and be used to fatten them up and keep them growing and healthy. So even if you can't use all of your milk, there are good uses for either the waste milk or the byproducts of milk that can enrich your farm in other ways. So it's more complicated than just collecting and consuming milk. When you get into milk products like, my wife has made yogurt, kefir, all kinds of cheeses, puddings, and so on. You're going to need some good recipes where you can use large quantities of milk because you're going to have it. My children were spoiled growing up where they could just eat big bowls of pudding as a treat because we had so much milk available. My wife would always make pudding for the kids. I remember my kids walking around just drinking quart jars full of fresh farm yogurt and kefir because the quantities we had were so great, and the kids would help with the work of milking the animals, and their reward was just free access to the dairy products, and they loved it. We didn't do ice cream. I don't think we ever actually made ice cream because we were content with puddings and yogurts and kefir, so we never really were concerned with ice cream. And my wife, as a treat, used to make vanilla milk for the kids, where she would just put a little sugar and vanilla into some milk and serve it as a treat, almost like a milkshake. And that was sufficient for us because our tastes were simple. We never made much or any ice cream. But my wife did make cheeses, delicious cheeses that we used to spread on fresh homemade bread at dinner time or as a snack and things like that. She made all kinds of cheeses. And of course, the variety of cheeses differ whether you're milking goats or cows, so you'll need to learn about that. But if you've got questions of how to work with the milk and produce dairy products, I recommend you get in touch with my wife, because she's a real master in that area and makes some delicious dairy products in the home in very efficient ways. No fancy equipment or anything like that. Very simple production of dairy products that our family has always enjoyed. So there's a lot to think about when you consider milking animals, and I hope that in this talk I've helped you to think ahead to some of the things that come upon a family that's milking animals that they might not think about before they get started. And these are the kinds of things that get families into trouble and cause all kinds of losses. Worst of all, and this has to be taken very seriously, worst of all is the sickness and even death of valuable dairy animals. This really isn't a joke. And like I said, even nursing mothers develop breast infections and sicknesses as they're feeding their children, and those same diseases can develop in goats and cows. And unlike humans, goats and cows are not going to be able to care for themselves, and once they get sick, they usually go downhill pretty quickly, or they never recover from sicknesses. Even though they may regain their physical health, they lose the ability to produce milk. For example, in cows or even in goats, one udder can become infected and just never function again. So a large portion of that animal's milk production is just lost permanently. So there are a lot of things to consider, and I think the most important thing is to get started in an easy and simple way, being patient, setting long-term goals for milk production on your family farm, and just moving forward one step at a time, little by little, working your way up from the simplest milking of, let's say, dairy goats, 1 or 2 dairy goats, up to eventually milking cows and possibly milking multiple cows. I really think you should begin with the simplest animals to handle and collect milk from, and work your way up to avoid getting into any trouble. It's also much more affordable financially to begin with goats than cows. So I've shared what I think are some of the most important issues and concerns. I have to admit, like as I've said, there's really nothing on the farm that can compare with enjoying fresh farm milk and all of the other products that come from that milk. But it takes some real preparation and commitment. It takes stability of life. You've got to have financial resources to get started. You've got to have the stability that allows for regular daily milking and processing of milk. There's just a lot to think about, and I hope that this talk helps you to identify those issues that need to be thought through and prepared for. And if there's anything that I can do to help you think through it and prepare, please get in touch and let me know. I hope that's helpful. I wish you well. I hope that I can help you get off to a successful start in milking on your farm. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to get in touch, either by commenting on this video or simply sending me an email. My email address is wcm@classicalliberalarts.com. I hope that's helpful. God bless.